Well, hello there. This video is going to be different. Now, normally, this channel is obviously all about samurai history, samurai film reviews, samurai game reviews, but from time to time, I do like to make videos on other subjects related to Japan or Japanese history in general, which is exactly what I want to do here today as we cover the fascinating story of the Japanese national football team, also known by their nickname, the Samurai Blue. So there is that connection to samurai if you want to make it, but just in name.
The story of football development in Japan is one I have come to learn more and more about in recent years, ever since I started following the Japanese national football team more seriously in 2018. And if you have been following me on Facebook, X, or Discord, you would know I have been repping the Japanese national team pretty consistently over the years. Yet what I have come to notice about Japan is how the way in which they have attempted to develop their football program by modeling itself after Western examples, interestingly enough, mirrors other famous events in Japanese history, going back centuries. And with Japan's continued success and their status as the top FIFA-ranked team in Asia, I think there has never been a better time to talk about their story. However, I wanted to wait on this video, wait for Japan to see out their run in the 2026 World Cup. And with their hard-fought defeat at the hands of Brazil in the round of 32 after going undefeated in all of their prior matches, I think it is now time to look back and assess. One thing I of course need to mention before we dive in is that I'm not an expert on football, or soccer as we call it here in the United States.
Rather, I'm much more knowledgeable on American football, not only because I grew up playing it, but also because I was raised just a mile or two away from the storied Lambeau Field. You could say American football is in my DNA.
With that said, when it comes to football for the rest of the world, and the Japanese national team in particular, this video will be less about tactics and intricacies of the sport and more about the general story of football in Japan itself and the interesting rise of the Japanese national team. Now, some people might ask, why is discussing the national team considered important? Why not just talk about the sport itself in Japan? And while we will be doing a lot of that as it is in order to tell this story, it's also important to understand that for most players, playing for your country's national team is considered the real height of the sport itself. Nothing else tops representing your nation at the international level by competing in the biggest tournaments in the world. So, join me as we examine the history of the Samurai Blue, as we see how Japan became the football powerhouse of Asia while also importing elements from other countries and innovating in significant ways. How did the Japanese national team climb the ranks to compete with the best of the best? Let's dive in and find out. To start off, it is important to understand that Japan was not inherently a football nation. Without getting too deep into the history of the sport itself, football as we have come to internationally recognize it didn't really properly emerge until the 19th century. There had of course been other foot and ball related games in other countries long before this. For Japan in particular, an early comparison that can be made is kemari, a game which originated back during the Heian period and was a favorite among the Japanese aristocracy. It's still actually played at certain events to this day. It was a game in which players attempted to keep the ball off the ground by passing it back and forth, only using their feet. But in terms of modern football itself, it really didn't properly arrive in Japan until the early 1870s, just several years after the Meiji Restoration and the end of the old Tokugawa shogunate. From there, the game spread in popularity. With Japan undergoing a heavy wave of westernization in their attempts to modernize, many Western customs were being integrated into Japanese society. Thus it makes sense that Japan would also want to adopt this popular Western sport, much like they would also do with baseball.
Now, as we know, baseball is Japan's #1 sport, with football coming in second. But it has even taken quite some time for football in Japan to even achieve that place.
1917 could potentially be viewed as the first real major year for the sport in Japan, as the 1917 Far Eastern Championship Games took place in Japan between Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino teams. The games themselves included multiple sports ranging from football to baseball, basketball, tennis, volleyball, and others. It was here that the Japanese football team performed rather poorly against other teams, losing 5-0 to China and 15-2 against the Philippines. The nation, of course, was not disheartened, and rather Japan recommitted their resolve to improve at football. 4 years later, establishing the first iteration of the Japan Football Association, or JFA. Originally, the Japanese name for the association was the Dainippon Shūkyū Kyōkai, or Greater Japan Football Association. Yet, after World War II, the name would be shortened down just to Nihon Shūkyū Kyōkai. The main emblem of the JFA has gone through slight variations over the years, but has always included a yatagarasu, mythical Japanese three-legged crow clutching a football, although the most recent version has the ball resembling more of the sun itself. 1921 would also be the first year that the Emperor's Cup would be held, a grand tournament in which local football clubs in Japan and even Japan's imperial colonies could all compete. The Emperor's Cup is still held annually to this day. By 1929, the JFA would officially join the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, or FIFA. Japanese football was slowly advancing. At the 1936 Berlin Olympics, Japan stunned a European nation by defeating Sweden in the round of 16. However, in the quarterfinals, they went down to lose in a brutal 8-0 thrashing by Italy, who then went down to win gold. In 1954, FIFA would establish the Asian Football Confederation, or AFC, which itself organizes football competitions for national teams and clubs throughout Asia, but not including Russia, Turkey, Kazakhstan, and a few others who instead fall under European football jurisdiction. Within several years, the AFC would begin hosting the Asian Cup every 4 years, pitting the best national teams in Asia against each other for the top spot. Yet it would not be until 1988 that Japan would finally qualify to even participate in the Asian Cup, which is interesting considering other Japanese football successes like that at the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico, where Japan would shock the host country by defeating Mexico 2-0, taking third place and the bronze medal. To this day, this is the only medal for Japanese men's football at the Olympics. It would not be until 2012 that the Japanese women's team would also take home silver. Going back to the Asian Cup, however, Japan's inaugural run in 1988 didn't go well, and Japan failed to make it to the knockout rounds. However, in the 1992 Asian Cup, the situation was different. The JFA had brought on Hans Oft from the Netherlands as their official manager of the national team. Bringing in foreigners as coaches and players was nothing new for clubs of the former Japan Soccer League, as Oft himself had been coaching in Japan throughout the 1980s. Yet this was a first for the national team, as Oft became the first foreigner brought on to that position. Additionally, Japan was the host nation for the 1992 Asian Cup, and thus benefited from having home field advantage. It was here the Japanese national team was able to fight their way into the semifinals, defeating China 3-2 to then play a final match against Saudi Arabia, where they would win 1-0.
Japan had finally won their first international competition, and everything was about to change. Whereas before, Japan had been a slowly developing football nation with moments of success in larger competitions, by the 1990s, Japan's relationship with football would take on a new form. This is where football in Japan started to get serious. But this is where we have to briefly pivot to answer an important question. How does a nation even become good at football? Well, the first answers you might get are actually just more questions, such as, does your nation have a professional league? Is that league importing foreign talent? Does your league have academies set up to build the next generation of players? All these questions, all these goals were what the JFA set out to achieve.
In the same year as Japan won its first Asian Cup, it would also officially establish the J-League, the country's professional football league. It took the place of the former Japan Soccer League, which had been structured much like Japan's professional baseball league, which was mostly made up of teams owned by large corporations. The original Japan Soccer League was dominated by amateur players and itself was not very popular, especially when compared to other major sports in Japan like that of baseball and even sumo, which remains one of Japan's top sports today. Despite this, as mentioned earlier, the original Japan Soccer League had started bringing in foreign talent, so Japan was beginning to expose itself to styles of play from Europe and South America, helping to advance their own ability. The foundation was there for Japan to simply take the next step in terms of football development, which the JFA was now prepared to do. What is interesting is that Japan was not alone in this process. By 1993, the United States was also trying to catch up to the rest of the world when it came to football as well. In that same year, they would establish Major League Soccer, or MLS, which took the place of the previous North American Soccer League. Just like Japan, the US was also attempting to take the next step in their country's football development so that they could be taken seriously with the sport. And certainly, MLS has become more and more popular over the years, with big-name foreign stars coming to the US and even the US creating some quality players of their own. One way in which Japan appeared to be ahead of the US, however, was in terms of football academies. The first football academies in Japan came with the establishment of the J-League. But even besides that, football was already a popular competitive sport in Japanese high schools and colleges. The already high popularity of football in schools made the development of talent more accessible from an early age. After playing in college or spending time at a youth academy, talented players might be able to sign on to a J-League team to continue their career, where they would also come to potentially play alongside foreign players and perhaps under foreign coaches to gain new skills and perspectives. Of course, this system would take time to properly get up and running. And if we look at FIFA's official men's ranking system, Japan was ranked 66th place in 1992.
This is where the JFA came forth with the storied 100-year plan, a multifaceted vision to establish a powerful football culture in Japan through the expansion of the J-League, and then using that aspiring talent to propel themselves on the world stage, with the goal of hopefully winning a World Cup within, you guessed it, the next 100 years.
As mentioned, significant progress was not immediate, however. In 1993, Japan narrowly failed to qualify for their first World Cup in a match which has been dubbed in Japan as the Agony of Doha, where on the cusp of a 2-1 victory over Iraq, Iraq would score a second goal within the last few minutes of the match, causing the match to result in a 2-2 draw, which then resulted in Japan not qualifying for the World Cup. Oh yeah, this guy was here too. He'll become very significant later. Following this result, Oft was removed as manager of the national team, and in the decades since, we have seen the team continue to be helmed by a mixture of Japanese and foreign-born coaches. By 1996, the year of the next Asian Cup, the efforts of the JFA and J-League had resulted in Japan jumping all the way up to 21st place on FIFA's world rankings. Unfortunately, Japan would not make it as far this time around, winning their group but then falling in the quarterfinals in a 2-0 loss to Kuwait. By 1997, the year of the next World Cup qualifiers, FIFA now ranked Japan as number 14th in the world, truly showing how their progress was increasing. This time, they would, at long last, qualify and head to France for Japan's first ever World Cup appearance. So, how did they do in their first World Cup? Not good. Terrible, in fact. They lost all of their group stage matches, coming in last in their group and exiting before the knockout rounds. Yet, just having made it there alone was certainly an indication that Japan was heading in the right direction, and Japan has continued to qualify for every World Cup since, with the exception of 2002, where they were a co-host nation along with South Korea and thus automatically qualified. Yet, they would make it past the group stage to the knockout rounds in 5 of the 7 World Cups between 1998 and 2026. In the 2000 Asian Cup, held this time in Lebanon, Japan would win the tournament for the second time, getting revenge against Iraq for the agony of Doha with a 4-1 win in the quarterfinals, before then going on to do an odd repeat of the 1992 Asian Cup by defeating both China and then Saudi Arabia in the final match. They would come back to win the Asian Cup again in 2004 and then later in 2011, making Japan the nation with the most men's Asian Cup wins out of any country as of 2026. Japan is also a regular participant in the much smaller East Asian Football Championship, a tournament held between teams who are part of the East Asian Football Federation, which itself is under the AFC. Since the start of the East Asian Championship Games in 2003, Japan has managed to win it 3 times, with wins in 2013, 2022, and 2025. Korea, however, holds the record with 5 East Asian Championship wins. By 2005, with continued evidence of progress in Japan's football development, the JFA would move up their initial timeline. Now, instead of trying to win a World Cup by 2092, the goal was to win one by 2050. And as we will come to see, that dream might not be so crazy.
Now, it's here I need to mention something very important which occurred in the build-up to the 2006 World Cup. It was here that the JFA set out to establish a proper nickname for the team, as most national teams have. For example, the English national team is known as the Three Lions. France are Les Bleus. Belgium are the Red Devils. In Japan, by 2006, it was officially decided that their team was to be called the Samurai Blue, a name which the team had actually already been going by for some time, but unofficially. Samurai, because of the famous historical warrior class which had dominated the country for centuries, and blue because it was the color that the national team had just come to wear.
And so we enter into the Samurai Blue era of the Japanese national team, a time in which Japan has continued to improve on the world stage, going from an average football team to a genuine contender and threat. Today, they are continually called a dark horse whenever the World Cup comes around. But where did that all start? Personally, I would say the modern era of the Japanese national team starts in 2018. If the rise of Japanese football started in 1992, the age of Japan being actually respected as a football nation internationally, I think starts around 2018. Now, as I mentioned earlier, 2018 was also the first year I started to really get interested in the Japanese national team. This was only the second World Cup that I had really become invested in, after I watched a lot of the 2014 World Cup.
You have to keep in mind, as somebody who grew up in the United States, unless you were already really interested in soccer, the World Cup has always been much more on the periphery. Personally, from what I've seen, it really wasn't until 2018 and onward that the World Cup has become this larger spectacle here in the United States. But even then, before 2018, it never reached the same heights in popularity as, say, the Olympics, I would say from my own point of view.
Now, it was here in 2018, in a World Cup hosted by Russia, that Japan was placed into Group H with Colombia, Senegal, and Poland. The Samurai Blue would beat Colombia, tie Senegal, and lose to Poland. This all resulted in Japan coming in second in the group behind Colombia, where they then went on to play against Belgium in the round of 16. This is a game I distinctly remember having to listen to on the radio, given that my family was traveling at the time. Things initially looked incredible for Japan. After a scoreless first half, they would find a goal in the 48th minute and then again 4 minutes later in the 52nd. Now up by 2 points early in the second half, all Japan needed to do is either keep up the pressure or at least ride out the remainder of the match and they would be on to their first quarterfinal. However, that was not meant to be. Belgium has a serious knack for comebacks and would score 2 more goals against Japan by the 74th minute. Now Japan either needed to score another or at the very least hold out until extra time. Then came the final nail in the coffin, a Belgian goal in the 94th minute during stoppage time. Japan were sent home. Yet they did give a top European team a serious scare, which indicated once again how far Japan was progressing. In the end, France would go on to win the 2018 World Cup, an event I will always remember because I was actually in Paris at the time, and the atmosphere was as electric as you could expect. Yet, knowing how well the Samurai Blue had performed overall in 2018 gave a lot of people hope for how well they could do in 2022. Following the 2018 World Cup, Japan was due for a new head coach, who would end up being Hajime Moriyasu. Remember that player who I pointed out earlier? Moriyasu had previously played for the Japanese national team and had played in the infamous Agony of Doha match in 1993. He had since gone on to become a coach and was even on the coaching staff for Japan at the 2018 World Cup. Now it was his turn at the helm, and we can see quickly that Moriyasu showed plenty of promise, leading Japan to be runners-up at the 2019 Asian Cup and then a fourth-place finish at the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, which were held in 2021 for pandemic reasons. He would also lead Japan to, of course, qualify for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. Then came the group stage draw. Who would Japan be initially placed against this time around? Well, Japan ended up being in what many consider to be 2022's group of death, being placed with the European titans of Germany and Spain. Oh yeah, and Costa Rica was there too.
What is a group of death, you might ask? Well, a group of death is when there's a whole bunch of elite teams all packed together in the same group. So right away, it was looking pretty bleak for Japan. It might take a miracle for them to even squeak through in second place and make it onto the knockout rounds. Or so we thought.
Coming into the tournament, Japan were ranked 24th in the world, with the only Asian team ranked above them being Iran at 20th place. Japan's first match would be against Germany and would take place on November 22nd of 2022. I could tell you right away from the announcers here on Fox in the US, it was abundantly clear that Germany were the favorites, and there was probably a bit of bias in that too. Yet, Japan looked immediately dangerous, nearly scoring a goal in the 7th minute before being ruled offsides. Germany would score though first in the 33rd minute, which came off of a penalty after Japan's goalkeeper Shuichi Gonda committed a foul in the box. Germany nearly scored again even before it was ruled offsides as well. Now, under Moriyasu, Japan had adopted largely a defensive strategy, hunkering down until being able to quickly issue a dangerous counterattack. So, for much of the game, Japan was on the ropes as Germany continued to pound them. Miraculously, Japan denied any other attempt for Germany to score, when finally, in the 75th minute, Japan, feeling a second wind off of substitutions, came forth with an equalizer from Ritsu Doan. The German victory now looked uncertain, and with momentum swinging in Japan's favor, it was game on. And only 8 minutes later, the unthinkable occurred. Takuma Asano came screaming in with an incredible goal that left the stadium and announcers stunned. Japan was now winning 2-1, and with little time remaining, Japan was able to hold out to hand Germany their first and only defeat of the entire tournament, one that no one expected.
But there were wonderings. Was it all just a fluke? Did Japan get lucky?
Their next match against Costa Rica only seemed to confirm this, as Japan was unable to find the back of the net against a team that many considered inferior to Japan, eventually resulting in Costa Rica scoring in the 81st minute and ending with a Japan loss. All signs pointed to the Germany game being a fluke, as Japan now had to go on to face Spain, a team ranked 7th in the world at the time and who had defeated Costa Rica 7-0 and had drawn 1-1 against Germany. Spain's quality was quickly seen when they scored in just the 11th minute, putting Japan behind and risking a Japan exit from the tournament if Germany defeated Costa Rica, who they were also playing at the same time. Luckily, Japan managed to hold off the Spanish for the rest of the half. Then came Japan's early second half substitutions, bringing on Ritsu Doan yet again, who had scored the equalizer against Germany. It only took 3 minutes into the second half for Doan to score against Spain, leveling the score 1-1. Just like Germany before them, Spain was shocked by the tenacious Japanese offensive, one that came back again just 3 minutes after that in the 51st minute, with one of the greatest goals in the entire tournament. Perhaps the greatest goal in Japanese national team history. The infamous "did it go out?" goal. It was here, after a pass from Doan. The ball looked as though it had gone over the line and thus out of play, despite Kaoru Mitoma's kick bringing it back in and off of Ao Tanaka to put Japan up. The VAR check felt like it took years, but then the results came in. It was determined that the entirety of the curvature of the ball had not crossed the line. The ball had thus stayed in, and Japan's goal stood. Japan was now up against Spain, 2-1. But unlike the game against Germany, this was still rather early in the second half, and Spain had plenty of time to retake the lead, if they could, which they could not. Japan held firm, defeating Spain and winning the entire group. They would also knock Germany out of the World Cup, being that Spain would finish second in the group with the higher goal differential between the two. So not only had Japan been placed into the group of death with Germany and Spain, but they had also gone on to defeat both of them to win the entire group. The win over Germany was not a fluke after all. Japan had not just gotten lucky. The win over Spain proved to the world that Japanese football was strong, and that the Japanese national team was indeed a true force to now be reckoned with.
I cannot begin to describe to you what watching these games was like. As a Japan fan, you felt everything from the deepest depths of despair to the highest levels of joy. It was incredible.
And this is where I began to see attention for the Japanese national team start to skyrocket, as more and more people were falling in love with this underdog team. It's also where people really started to take notice of the Japanese fans' kind habit of cleaning up stadiums after each match, something which they had actually been doing for quite some time, yet was only recently starting to become a sensation. However, for as much attention as Japan was garnering, the next match would be their steepest challenge yet. It was now the round of 16, and as of yet, the Japanese men's team has never won a knockout round match at the World Cup. Their opponent was to be Croatia, who just in 2018 had been the runners-up of the whole tournament, losing to France in the final. Croatia is always a solid team, and this was still prime years for their star player, Luka Modric. Japan played hard, showing all of the talent from the previous matches and scoring first with a goal from my personal favorite player, Daisen Maeda, in the 43rd minute. Yet in the second half, Croatia came back with an equalizer in the 55th minute. The two sides continued to duke it out with no goals for the remainder of regular time and into extra time, forcing the match to head on to a penalty shootout. It was here that we learned that despite Japan's tactical brilliance, they still lacked the skills to win a penalty shootout, with Asano being the only player to score his goal, while Croatia were able to send in 3 to win the game. Japan's epic run at the 2022 World Cup was over, but the wins were far from done.
Behind the scenes, something was changing the overall DNA of the Japanese national team. A slow process that had not really started to show off until perhaps around 2018. It's here we need to ask ourselves, where are the best Japanese players playing? Because as of today, it's not really the J-League anymore.
After making a name for themselves in the J-League, the majority of the best Japanese players are now being picked up by European teams. We now have Japanese football players playing in England, Germany, France, Belgium, Italy, Scotland, and more, each of them earning top spots on their teams and continuing to excel. It should not come as a surprise to anyone when I say Europe is the football epicenter of the world. Although there are leagues in countries all over the globe, most people will tell you that nothing else truly compares to playing in Europe. And Japanese players are not just playing in Europe, but are playing in top European leagues. Some have come to define this process as the J-League to European pipeline, and certainly it has come to show within Japan's national team. Although Japan's 2014 squad had plenty of players who had either played in Europe or were playing actively in Europe at the time, 2018 is perhaps really where that number of players was the vast majority. This means that players being called up for the Japanese national team are ones with a high level of experience, not only coming from top-tier teams with different playstyles, but also playing alongside many other world-class athletes who they would come to then face off against in the World Cup. By the 2026 World Cup, only 2 players on Japan's entire national team were not currently playing in Europe, that being the backup goalkeeper Tomoki Hayakawa and the experienced Yuto Nagatomo, who was playing in his 5th World Cup and already had a long career playing on multiple European teams. This is one of the major factors that makes the Japanese national team so dangerous today, because just like all the other top international teams, Japan's players now all come from the same top-tier European environment. And this is where we can make an interesting connection between Japanese football development and Japanese history in general. In Japanese history, modernization at the end of the Edo period and into the Meiji period came with heavy westernization. Japan knew that in order to become a powerful modern nation, it needed to adopt methods of the West. Thus, they brought in knowledgeable Western advisors, sent students to study abroad, and eventually came to model their new government and military on European examples, while also implementing significant industrialization akin to developed Western countries. Over 100 years later, the JFA sought to do the same, establishing a professional football league and academy system like those in Europe, and bringing in foreign talent to help with their own domestic football development. Now, once the effects of this process have begun to pay off, Europe seeks to bring over top talent from Japan into their own leagues, which is also a way for Japan to continue developing their own football capabilities through first-hand experience. It is an incredible process that is really fascinating to dissect, and has all contributed to Japan growing into Asia's top football nation. The time in between the 2022 and 2026 World Cup was filled with more moments for Japan to prove itself. They would make it to the quarterfinals of the 2023 Asian Cup, which Japan's under-23 team would actually win that year, and make it to the quarterfinals of the 2024 Paris Olympics after topping their group by winning all 3 games, only to then lose to Spain, who themselves went on to win gold. Spain, of course, would also win the Euro 2024 and the 2026 World Cup, which I can now say because I'm recording this video a day after the final. So Spain right now are on top of the world, and there is no shame in losing to them. It does make it even cooler though that Japan managed to beat them in 2022 right before their epic rise. As mentioned a while earlier, Japan would also win the 2025 East Asian Championship, scoring back-to-back championship victories against South Korea and earning their 3rd East Asian title overall. But in terms of international friendlies, and I know there is only so much weight we can put behind friendly matches, Japan was still extremely dominant, notably beating Germany again 4-1, Brazil 3-2, and England 1-0. In the qualifiers for the 2026 World Cup, they would be the first non-host team to qualify. Japan continued to showcase their might, decimating Myanmar and Syria in the 2nd round, before then going on in the 3rd round to destroy China 7-0, Indonesia 6-0, Bahrain 5-0, and Saudi Arabia 2-0. The only team that gave Japan any real challenge was Australia, who in their 2 matches tied Japan and then later beat Japan 1-0. Now, the interesting thing about the 2026 World Cup, as you may already know, was that it was to be the first ever time that FIFA was expanding it from originally 32 teams to now 48 teams. There is even talk of expanding it further in the years to come. This means more groups in the group phase and a longer tournament overall with an expanded knockout round, which now includes a round of 32. Japan ended up in Group F with the Netherlands, Sweden, and Tunisia. But before the 2026 World Cup could even begin, the Samurai Blue would be met with a difficult series of events. Kaoru Mitoma and Takumi Minamino, 2 of Japan's top players who had not only been on Japan's squad in the 2022 World Cup and who had also continued to perform exceptionally well in the years since, were both injured and eventually ruled out. Wataru Endo, a Liverpool star and Japan's team captain, was also injured but was supposedly going to be ready by the time the World Cup began. He was not, and unfortunately was replaced. These were 3 of Japan's top players, key leaders on the pitch who would be sorely missed.
And this is where two separate arguments began to pop up. On one hand, people were quick to point out that Japan has a well-drilled system. They don't suffer as much from key players not being there because they have other players of sufficient quality ready to step into those positions. On the other hand, Japan does lack star power and they need all the help they can get. There's no major names that we think of when we look at the Japanese national team. There's no players like Messi, Mbappe, Ronaldo, Haaland, or Yamal to think of. Star players are important because not only are they there to help dominate the pitch and score goals, but also they can help rally the team to get them out of tough situations. As we'll come to see in the 2026 World Cup, both arguments have some shred of truth to them.
Japan's first match was arguably set to be their toughest, the Netherlands, a team that is consistently described as one of Europe's best, despite never having won a World Cup themselves. How Japan performed in this match would determine the state of the team for sure. The match itself was as hard-fought as you would expect. Neither team would be able to score within the first half as the Dutch held the majority of possession and that impervious Japanese defense held the line. By the second half, the match finally opened up as the Netherlands found a goal in the 51st minute. They would only enjoy their lead for 6 minutes though, as Keito Nakamura struck back to level the score. The Dutch then scored again in the 64th minute, setting Japan back once more. The Dutch attempted to then hunker down and ride out the remainder of the match as Japan hammered them again and again, trying to find the back of the net, until finally, in the 88th minute, Japan scored off an incredible header, tying the game. With it already so late in the match, it would ultimately end in a draw. Japan had survived. Certainly, it was not the incredibly fiery quality we had seen in the 2022 World Cup, but it was still a tenacious performance for what many thought was going to be the best match of the group. The biggest problem, however, another one of Japan's best players, Takefusa Kubo, would be injured. Like Mitoma, Minamino, and Endo, Kubo was seen as an instrumental player on the Japanese squad. Not having him for the foreseeable future would be heartbreaking. But there was still a glimmer of hope that he would be able to return at some point later in the tournament, we just didn't know when. The second match was to be against Tunisia, who, after losing badly to Sweden in their first match, had even fired their original head coach mid-tournament. This was actually going to be the 1000th World Cup match of all time, so it certainly meant a lot going in, even besides the stakes of the group stage. In the end, Japan trounced Tunisia, winning 4-0, with 2 goals from Ayase Ueda, 1 goal from Daichi Kamara, and another from Junya Ito. Japan had not only won the 1000th match in World Cup history, but also set new records for the most goals scored and highest goal differential in a single World Cup match by any Asian team ever. But there was little time to celebrate these achievements, as they were off to their final group stage match against Sweden, with a top spot in the group on the line. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this World Cup was different due to the expanded roster of teams and the additional knockout round. There was now the possibility to have 8 third-place teams advance to the knockout round as well. Sweden, understanding this, opted to play the match against Japan extremely defensively. Winning was still most ideal, but a draw would also suffice. Playing against an incredibly entrenched opponent, Japan was only able to score once, thanks again to my favorite player, Daisen Maeda, who now has hair by the way. Yet, Sweden struck back shortly after, leveling the match and causing it to eventually result in a draw. Overall though, it was an optimal result for both teams, because Japan had not only secured their position as second place in the group and thus had qualified for the knockout rounds, and Sweden had as well assured they would make an appearance as a third place team.
In the end, Group F would be rather cursed. The extended format of this World Cup made it so that there were some interesting situations. Whereas in prior World Cups, the winners of groups would go on to play second place teams from other groups, this time there were some first place teams who would end up going on to play some third place teams. This made it so that there were potentially some uneven matchups.
For example, Sweden now had to go up against France, which was essentially a death sentence. That is not saying each third-place team fared poorly. In fact, some overperformed like Paraguay and Cabo Verde. But overall, there were complaints about the balance being somewhat off. Meanwhile, Japan and the Netherlands were off to have incredibly competitive matches against Brazil and Morocco, respectively. Just like the Croatia match in the prior World Cup, facing off against five-time world champions Brazil was going to be Japan's latest great test. Could this team full of injuries somehow pull off a stunning win over a team often considered a football titan? And it is worth noting that Japan had beaten Brazil in a friendly only the previous year, so certainly it was a possibility to do so here now again in a more serious tournament. And, well, they nearly did it. Japan was able to score first after a brilliant goal from Kaishu Sano in the 29th minute, and then held out to go into halftime with the lead. It was clear Japan had rattled Brazil. Yet, Brazil would come back out with a vengeance in the second half, scoring in the 56th minute to tie things up. Both teams were unable to score again for almost the remainder of the match, and it looked like the match itself was going to be heading to extra time and potentially even a penalty shootout after, like what had happened with Croatia. But then, in the last minute of stoppage time, Brazil miraculously were able to create a goal, defeating Japan pretty much instantaneously. Once again, in the same old gutting fashion, Japan was sent home without winning a single knockout round match. Right away, numerous excuses were thrown around. Some claimed Japan played too defensively in the second half. Some people blamed certain players. Some said Japan got too tired. Others simply said that Japan lacked the same type of quality that Brazil had.
And while each of these arguments have their own strengths and weaknesses, the one argument that I didn't really see too many people pointing out again is the fact that Japan was still down 4 of their best players. Had those players been there, that game could have gone differently. Heck, the whole tournament could have gone differently. Thinking about the Netherlands game, I know Kubo was there for part of it, but they could have certainly beat the Netherlands. Think about the Sweden game. They could have come out on top of Sweden with that extra power. And Brazil, they could have certainly held off Brazil. But we don't know. It wasn't meant to be.
Interestingly enough, the Netherlands would also go on to lose their match against Morocco. Thus, the entirety of Group F found itself quickly eliminated from the World Cup. If I'm not mistaken, they were the first full group that was eliminated in 2026. Regardless, it was still a record-breaking run for Japan. From scoring the most goals in a single match for any Asian team at the World Cup after their 4-0 win over Tunisia, having Yuto Nagatomo as the first Asian player to play in 5 World Cups, and breaking a number of other Japanese-specific records as well, like going unbeaten in the group stage. Their performance in the 2026 World Cup is still something Japan can be proud of. And following their exit, as of making this video, they sit ranked 17th in the world, still the highest of any Asian team. In the aftermath, the Samurai Blue were welcomed home as heroes, despite failing to make it further in the tournament, which unfortunately was not the case for some other nations. Hajime Moriyasu received a short extension to lead the national team through the upcoming 2027 Asian Cup in Saudi Arabia, after which it is understood that he will leave the team. Arguments have already been arising online over what the best future course should be for the national team, with some people calling for the JFA to hire another foreign coach to come in and shake things up, recognizing potential problems with the current tactics used by Moriyasu and the team. Instead, as of July 23, 2026, as many had already predicted, Go Oiwa has been selected by the JFA to replace Moriyasu once Moriyasu's current term ends. Oiwa has been managing the under-23 Japanese national team and has won 2 under-23 Asian Cups, so it will be interesting to see if his success will continue. Yet, as for Moriyasu himself, no matter what you might think of him, love him or not, Moriyasu will go down as one of Japan's most beloved and long-running managers, having led the team for roughly 8 years and easily the manager with the most wins under his belt, currently sitting at 74 wins, 16 draws, and 18 losses at the time of making this video. The only other manager who comes close in Japanese national team history is the Brazilian coach Zico, who led the team for 4 years, while ending with also 16 draws and 18 losses, but only 37 wins. Moriyasu will forever be honored and cherished by the Japanese for what he has done with the national team, But as his era comes to a close, we are left to wonder what the future has in store for the Samurai Blue. And I will certainly be posting the results of the next Asian Cup, which takes place in early 2027, as a pinned comment to this video when it finishes, so that you can see how this story has progressed.
But as for the World Cup itself, will we still be asking the same question? Will Japan be able to win it by 2050? Well, yes and no, because they've already won it.
Something I haven't mentioned this entire video is women's football. Alongside the development of men's football in Japan, there is also the story of women's football as well. Japanese women's football has arguably performed better than the men's at the international level, not only making it further in the Olympics, placing silver in 2012 as I mentioned earlier, but also winning the Women's World Cup in 2011. Yeah, they did that. Japan has won a World Cup, just not with the men's team. As of making this video, the Japanese women's team are just one of 5 different nations to have done it since the Women's World Cup began in 1991. In fact, as some of you might already know, the US, who also have yet to win a men's World Cup, have instead won the Women's World Cup 4 times. And while I know it's not the same, of course, men's and women's sports are often looked at differently in terms of prestige and popularity, it is still definitely something that I feel is worth noting.
So, as much as we want to talk about Japan, or the US for that matter, having never won a World Cup, I do think there should be an asterisk by that number because both nations technically have, just not the men. Just not yet. Maybe someday. And until that day comes, I'll be rooting every year for the Samurai Blue.
Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most interesting.